In Florida, storms, wind, and waves sculpt the seacoast. Left to the powerful forces of nature, the place where the ocean meets the land is dynamic, fluid, and ever-shifting. But here, beaches anchor high-stakes hotels and splash billions into the economy, and nourish threatened and endangered species. Human hands are changing Florida's shorelines forever, but they can also help preserve and protect the living beach. The Florida Peninsula dangles off the southeast tip of North America, separating the open waters of the Atlantic from the Gulf of Mexico. Florida is famous for its sandy shores, and there's plenty to go around. It has the most tidal shoreline of any state in the continental USA. All combined, Florida's beaches are the most popular tourist attraction in the country, which poses some huge problems because its beaches are also homes for wildlife. In Florida, officials use three very different approaches to manage and maintain the beaches: for animals, for people, and to protect the coastline from Mother Nature's raw power. Lying just offshore from Florida's bustling mainland, an untamed gem glimmers in the waters of the Gulf of Mexico. Sanibel Island. Unspoiled and mostly undeveloped. A rarity in southern Florida. Sanibel Island formed when the sediment from the Caloosahatchee River began piling up on an undersea plateau 6,000 years ago. As the sand built up, shells began to accumulate here too.
Part of that's because of geography. Sanibel lies east to west, and most of the rest of the coast lies north to south, and most of the currents run north to the south. So the island tends to act as a big stopping block for anything that's getting pushed along down on the bottom of the ocean.
Today, it's a haven for wildlife, and more than half of the island is set aside as nature preserves. Its lagoons and mangroves host thousands of birds and invertebrates. Gopher tortoises dig their burrows into the loose sand. Manatees bask in the shallow water offshore. Locals know it's important to protect it all, right down to the seaweed washing up on the beach. Beach experts call these deposits at the high water mark racklines.
Piles of debris pile up on the beach, and it may look unsightly, but what it's doing is, as that vegetation breaks down, it starts to take hold of seeds and everything, and you can see this line of sea oats right here was once a rackline. Those racklines help promote the new growth and everything, which in turn provides excellent habitat for beach nesting birds. We have a snowy plover nest here. Snowy plovers are shorebirds that nest, that have been recorded since the early 90s, nesting on Sanibel Island.
These little birds specifically adapted to living on the beach.
One of the things that is important for the snowy plover is they use a lot of camouflage. If you look at the beaches on the island here, all the shell fragments and everything, the shadows that those create on the beach, incorporated with the plumage of the bird, do a great deal to camouflage the birds. See how the bird just squatted down because the crow came by? That's his predator reaction right there, it's camouflage.
The plovers need natural beaches for nesting.
These birds' nests, what they look like, they're really no bigger than the cup of your hand. If you were to take a tennis ball or a baseball and slam it into the sand, that indent that ball makes is really what these nests are. The male will make several practice nests. These we call them scrapes. What he does is he basically takes his breast and sticks it in the sand and then kicks his feet out in a circular motion and makes a perfect little cup. If the male makes a scrape that the female likes, they'll go ahead and they'll mate. They'll go in what I call shell. They'll shell the scrape, and they line the scrape with tiny little fragments of shells, 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch size. That's to keep the eggs off of the sand, and once the chicks hatch, to keep the chicks off the sand as well. Once those chicks initially hatch, they're all wet from the fluid in the egg and whatnot, so it helps to kind of keep the chicks a little clean for those first few moments after they hatch.
Plovers' eggs are so expertly camouflaged, they're almost impossible to see. That helps protect them from predators like raccoons, coyotes, birds, and snakes.
Their eggs basically look like little rocks. They're little speckled, they're tan, and they have little black and brown, dark brown speckles on them. So they look exactly like, pebbles or stones.
But the biggest threat to plovers isn't predators. It's people trampling their nests. Plovers' peak nesting season is April, prime tourist time in Florida. So on Sanibel Island, plover nesting sites are kept off limits to people. Elsewhere in America, construction and human interference destroy many snowy plover nesting sites. Since 20% of the plovers in southwest Florida are born there, the protected beaches on Sanibel Island provide a sanctuary. Conservationists established the first wilderness preserves on Sanibel in the 1920s.
Sanibel's a really special place. Had it not been protected, it very well could have ended up like the rest of Florida, where you have all the big condos on the beaches. Our beaches are all ungroomed here, so everything's left natural.
A lot of people think of a beach as a static thing. This is the way the beach looks, that's the way it looked last year, and that's the way it's gonna look next year. And the beaches are actually extremely dynamic. They're continuously changing. Even just day to day, they can change. Where the sandbars are gonna shift, and how high up the tide comes. All of those things play a role in what the beach looks like on any given day.
A lot of these beaches, if you scan around here, you see a lot of nice vegetation. There's a lot of debris on the beach, and Sanibel has done a great deal to try to make their beaches as natural as possible. Where if you were to go to maybe the east coast of Florida or another place where they rake their beaches, they have these ideal human beaches that are devoid of vegetation. Those are absolutely terrible for the most part, not very good for wildlife.
Sanibel's outer beaches are important for wildlife. And so are the shores of its inland lagoons. When the tide goes out, it reveals entire new worlds. These fiddler crabs number in millions on the shores of Sanibel's lagoons. Each one is about the size of a watch face, legs and all. The male crabs have one outsized claw, which gives fiddler crabs their name. The smaller claw moves like a bow on a fiddle. When the tide retreats, they emerge and swarm on the beach to engage in some very particular mating rituals. The males use their big claw to advertise for mates and stake their claim to their territory. This particular species of fiddler, whose scientific name means the boxer crab, has a reputation for packing a punch. When the males see a female they're interested in, they tap their big claws on the ground. The female crab picks her mate based on who's got the biggest claw. Size matters to female fiddlers, who lay their eggs in their mate's burrow. The bigger the claw, the bigger the burrow, which improves the success rate of eggs hatching. In 2 weeks, the female will emerge from the burrow and release her eggs into the receding tide. As the tide returns, the crabs retreat to their burrows. They pack the entrance with mud and wait until the water recedes again. The little fiddler crabs are big players in the symphony of Sanibel's food web. They're a food source for wading birds, and the tunnels they dig add oxygen to help seagrasses grow, providing food for fish and other creatures. All of Sanibel Island sits on top of sand and shells. The beach is a paradise for collectors, hunched over in what's called the Sanibel Stoop. Each shell once housed a tiny living creature, like this Florida fighting conch, about as long as your finger.
Shells are actually body parts of animals. There's a very large group of animals, an entire phylum called the mollusks. They cannot ever leave their shell. It's physically impossible for them to choose to leave the shell. It's a permanently attached body part. So when you're out looking for shells on the beach, those shells are actually a dead skeleton of an animal. The animal has died, the soft parts have decayed, and you're just collecting the hard part that's left over.
There are many different groups of mollusks. Conchs are a type of gastropod, sea snails that live on coral reefs and shallow seabeds. Bivalves, like cockles and clams, have 2 hinged shells. They're the most common shells found on Sanibel's beaches.
After big storms, sometimes that's actually the best shelling times. You end up with a lot of that debris, like dead shells that are down on the bottom of the ocean, coming up and getting deposited on the beach. So some of the really, really hardcore shellers are not as afraid of the hurricanes as everybody else is, because they know that means there's going to be some cool stuff out here to look at once the storm has passed through. These 2 weird-looking things are egg cases. This is where baby shells come from. This is the egg case of a lightning whelk, and this is the egg case of a horse conch. So you can see how different shaped they are. These 2 species aren't very closely related to each other, but they are both gastropods. And in this one, it looks like the babies developed, they were ready to hatch out, and then something happened that the babies didn't finish hatching. So one of them is right here. This is how big a horse conch starts out. And horse conchs are the second biggest gastropod in the world. We actually have the world record on display at the Bailey Matthews National Shell Museum. And that shell is 24 inches. So that 24-inch shell started off its life this big, and for years and years, it's just been adding to the outside of the shell, getting bigger out and around and around. So it never leaves this tiny shell it's born with. They just add to it for years and years and years.
In a protected habitat, a shell smaller than your fingernail can grow to be longer than your arm. The beaches on Sanibel showcase shells upon shells, a seemingly endless supply. But even little Sanibel cannot be an island against change forever. A tiny shift in this living beach's delicate balance is already bringing unthinkable results.
The pH of the oceans globally, the pH is actually going down. The oceans are becoming more acidic. That is bad news for anything with a hard shell. So it's bad news for corals and for mollusks.
There's already evidence that this acidity in the ocean, caused by increasing carbon dioxide, is making these animals produce thinner shells.
And we're starting to see evidence in highly industrialized places that this is happening faster because of the extra CO2 in the atmosphere. It gets absorbed into the ocean, starts dropping the pH, and then it starts breaking down those hard parts. The prediction is that in the next 50 years or so, we're going to start seeing that on a global level, even in places like here on Sanibel, where we don't have a lot of industrial pollution. But as the oceans mix and churn, that's going to start playing a role everywhere, going to affect everybody no matter where you live.
For the people who love Sanibel Island, the goal is to leave the beach alone. To protect and preserve it as a nesting habitat for birds and an attraction for nature lovers.
A long time ago, the inhabitants of Sanibel really realized what a special place this is, and that if we don't help protect it, that it's not going to be here for continuing generations to come and enjoy.
Without a history of protection and preservation, Sanibel could have turned into another sort of beach altogether. On the opposite side of the state, the coast is completely different. A beach man-made and carefully managed. Miami Beach, the American Riviera. Hot sun, white sand, bronzed bodies. This is the Sunshine State at maximum wattage. More people visit Florida's beaches than all the national parks and theme parks in the entire United States. Miami Beach is famous for fun in the sun. But if you think you're getting back to nature here, you're dead wrong. The only thing living on this beach is people. They call it the $1 billion sandbar. This beach is brought in one truckload and boatload at a time. And it was actually created to protect the city behind it. The city of Miami Beach is built on a barrier island, a long, narrow sandbar parallel to the mainland coast. Barrier islands take the brunt of the ocean's force, washing away and rebuilding between storms, protecting the mainland as well as inland marshes and wetlands. Miami Beach is a popular tourist destination. But 50 years ago, the beach didn't even exist. Developers built the city on a barrier island with construction all the way to the waterline, protected by a seawall.
That's what was happening from about the 1950s through the early 1970s. About 50% of the shoreline had no beach at high tide at all. It had seawalls. The original beach restoration project in Miami Beach was conducted by the Army Corps of Engineers. It involved the placement of about 17 million cubic yards of sand along 10.5 miles of shoreline. At that time, it was the biggest beach restoration project that had been done in the world.
This is now one of the most glamorous and exclusive zip codes in the state. But it's all sitting on top of sand. And keeping sand in a place where the ocean wants to wash it away is a never-ending project. We think of beaches as stable, but the sand above and below the waterline blows and flows with wind and currents, gradually drifting. The beach can eventually disappear altogether. The city of Miami Beach is constantly fighting nature to maintain its sandy playground.
We take sand from alternate areas. It can be offshore. It can be an inland source of sand that we would truck the sand to it. But essentially what we're doing is we're taking sand from another source and placing it where we need it on the beach. Now, part of the problem for us is that we're running out of available sand sources locally. We've been doing this for a really long time, and we've dredged a lot of the most suitable sand sources. And we have very strict requirements as far as the sand and what we can put on the beach. And so if you go from dredging sand from an area that's 2 miles offshore versus having to go to the center of the state, which is 130 miles away, your costs just skyrocket. And that's kind of what we're running into now.
Natural beaches and barrier islands are supposed to move and change. But now there's a city built on it. This artificial strip of sand is all that keeps the hotels of Miami Beach from falling into the sea.
We have a lot of infrastructure out here, a lot of high-end infrastructure, literally billions of dollars worth of property that are right on the beachfront. Beaches don't generally erode uniformly. And what we found is that we've got areas of the beach where, since the initial restoration back in the 70s and 80s, we haven't had to do anything to maintain the full beach width. We've had other areas that have been chronic erosion areas where we've had to go back 5, 6, 7 times to maintain the width and the protection that we need there. This area had the highest erosion rate in all of Miami. When you have a curve out on a flat beach, generally that curve will get attacked during storm events, and that's what was happening. The shoreline was all the way back behind where the dunes are. And so it was a very severely eroded area, created a lot of public safety issues because emergency vehicles couldn't get by at high tide.
At first, beach builders were fighting a losing battle here. Everything they laid down just washed away.
We would go in and do a large project and build the beach out to almost 300 feet wide. And 3 years later, we would need to do another project. People look at it in a lot of cases and they say, you know, you're putting all this sand out here, you're spending all that money to do it, and then we have a storm and it washes away. Well, the alternative is you don't put the sand out there and then your hotels wash away. Recognizing that it is a sacrificial barrier, that's the important thing, is it is put there as a storm buffer. By providing that protection when we do have a storm, and I say when we do have a storm, because we have and we will, a lot of this infrastructure, the damages that would occur otherwise are dramatically reduced.
One keystone to holding the beach together is a series of rock structures like this along the shore.
Instead of breaking wave energy, what they're doing is kind of holding the sand as an anchor as you transition around that curve on the beach. And it's worked very well.
After they built these breakwaters, the sand seemed to stay put. The beach is now 10 times as wide as it was naturally. And officials don't need to worry so much about it all washing away in normal weather. But the Atlantic coast of Florida regularly gets hit by huge storms that go well beyond normal.
We're very prone to effects of storm surges from hurricanes, and we're very vulnerable to sea level rise. Every year that passes, as the waters come up, we're going to be more and more vulnerable. So it's critical for our future here in South Florida that we learn how to forecast these things so we can get out of the way better. And we also learn how to make our homes and communities more resilient if we're going to continue to live here.
Just down the beach, researchers in this laboratory create their own storms to study to help Miami Beach prepare for the worst.
These are things that we can't study in nature. One, because it's really hard to be there with the equipment at the right time, and it's also just really hard to observe.
Researchers here built themselves a hurricane in a box. They can dial up the storm from Category 1 to Category 5 anytime they want. Dr. Brian House is testing better and smarter coastal infrastructure that could change the face of Miami Beach someday.
Here we have our sloping beach that we can use to build coastal structures on, to test models to see how we can improve resilience of coastal structures and coastal infrastructure. So the idea is you put a scaled model out there, you can hit it with these kinds of combined really strong winds and waves and water level to look at the forces on the structure so that we can make better planning, better designs to withstand these kinds of forces.
They're not worrying for nothing. In 1992, Hurricane Andrew slammed into the Florida coastline, killing dozens of people, racking up $25 billion worth of damage.
The situation in Miami is even more precarious than it might appear. Not only are we vulnerable to the storms coming off the Atlantic, but west of us, the Everglades is very low, and we sit on porous limestone. So there's no way to keep the water that comes from the west from coming underneath. We're basically like on Swiss cheese, right at water level next to the ocean.
There's a lot of people that are opposed to coastal development, and they say, well, as hotels get old, they should just tear them down and retreat from the shoreline. But the reality is, this is an economic engine for this area. So the best way to do it is to do it as cost effectively as you can, making sure that there are no negative environmental adverse effects, and basically that's where your focus needs to be, because the beach is always going to be there.
Miami Beach is a lot of things. It's an amazing feat of engineering. But one thing it's not is natural. It's a stark contrast to Sanibel Island. The beach is graded, groomed, and manicured. No rack lines of rotting seaweed or delicate bird nests here. Maybe there's a middle ground, a way to allow some development while preserving nature at the same time. In Sebastian, Florida, officials try to strike a balance. Sebastian is about 3 hours' drive north of Miami. The beach here is actively managed, but with nature in mind. Like Miami Beach, Sebastian is a barrier island, separated from the mainland by a lagoon. The inlet connecting the ocean with the lagoon behind the island would naturally change shape over time with the drifting sands. This beach can't be left alone like Sanibel, or its shifting shape would undermine the transportation infrastructure like roads and bridges. But it's an important wildlife habitat too, so it can't be artificially managed like Miami Beach. James Gray is the coastal engineer in charge of making the beach do what the people want, while maintaining it as a natural home for wildlife.
So we have 22.5 miles of shoreline, and my task is to protect and restore the critically eroded areas of our shoreline, which we have about 15.7 of the 22.5 miles are deemed critically eroded. There are other more natural alternatives as well, and that's plantings, dune plantings, trying to maintain more of a healthier dune. This grassy type habitat collects sand naturally, and it will build up the dunes over time.
Instead of just trucking in more sand like in Miami Beach, they're using a natural approach to keep the sand in place. It's not great for sunbathers and tourists, but it's terrific for wildlife who need the beach as a habitat.
In this case, you can kind of see all this little vegetation. These are sea oaks. We've planted these sea oaks at certain spacing to try to enhance the beach project that we put out and recreate more of a natural dune environment. As you see behind this smaller vegetation is larger sea oaks and sea grapes and other various species of plants. It's really starting to take off.
They're replicating what happens naturally in the racklines on Sanibel Island, only accelerated and carefully managed.
This dune right here, these were actually these little tiny dune vegetation about 3 years ago, and it's established in a way here where you can see it's natural looking. So you can't even tell. It looks, yes, it looks restored in this situation, but this is what it's going to look like a few years down the road. A very, very healthy dune system. You can see even the sea oaks are starting to seed and so forth, so further perpetuating the natural volunteering and enhancement of the dune feature.
The sand here is almost as fine as sugar and hard to keep hold of. The dune grasses act like a screen, catching the sand, keeping it from blowing out to sea.
And look how fine that material is. Higher up along the dune, you have more of this smaller grain-sized material that kind of, if you kind of see, you can see how important that vegetation is, because it's really collecting that sand. Over time, you get a dune that kind of looks like this, which is higher, and that's because the natural exchange with the wind and the sand and the vegetation. We're striving to maintain a dune system like this.
County officials in Sebastian Island are attempting a bit of a balancing act between the interests of wildlife and humans. The beach still attracts plenty of visitors, but it's a much slower pace than Miami Beach. It's not graded or groomed, and the people who come here are looking for pretty much the same things the wildlife are.
I'd like to get out here early in the morning before everybody else. This is paradise. And the beaches are, as you can see, there's not many people here. It's just something about the
The sun, the waves, the quietness. It's just peaceful. Don't tell anybody about my secret. I don't want a million people moving here.
The barrier island of Sebastian protects inland marshes where birds like this great blue heron make their nests. And a tiny island in the lagoon behind Sebastian is America's oldest wildlife preserve. It's a critically important rookery for seabirds like pelicans. This beach is all that protects it from the pounding storms of the open ocean.
High tide is the best time to come out here and fish. A higher tide brings the bait fishing closer, which then in turn brings the predatory fish in, what I'm trying to catch.
This great blue heron relies on its powerful neck and sharp beak to spear fish in the shallows off the shore. It's an iconic resident of the Florida coastline and a better angler than most of the tourists. At least somebody's catching fish. County officials set an ambitious and tricky goal for themselves: to make the beach seem so unmanaged, so natural, that even the animals don't notice.
Our beaches are extremely important for sea turtle nesting. They are some of the highest density nesting beaches for loggerheads around the world.
Loggerhead turtles are an endangered species. They can live as long as 67 years and travel huge expanses of ocean. Saving the species will require worldwide cooperation. And every loggerhead begins its life on a beach like this.
They need lots of protection and a lot of awareness to our community to know that they're there. So that's what I do. I get up beyond the beach myself, doing daily nest surveys, slowly counting the crawls.
To protect turtle eggs, Kendra Cope and her team look for the telltale signs of nesting turtles, then follow the tracks.
So this is a fresh nest. And this are going to be at the whitest part of the crawl, knees down in the middle. And you should be right here.
And then once they're found, get a GPS location of that clutch of eggs, and then mark it off with 3 big stakes around it and with a sea turtle sign. And then at the end of the day, that data all gets put into a giant database.
In a single year, researchers found 755 loggerhead nests in a stretch of beach that you can walk in just an hour.
She'll come in, dig her nest, cover, and as she's covering, she'll circle around and leave and head it back into the water. It's very characteristic. And you can see these eggs are about a foot deep into the sand, which gives them a lot of barrier protection from impacts on top of the sand, but just enough space to give it the right temperature and the right microclimate for these eggs to develop in.
There's only 50,000 nesting female loggerheads left in the world. So the 80,000 eggs laid on Sebastian Island are critical to the future of the species.
So we have a very high success rate in these areas. So when you're producing more hatchlings, you're also producing the likelihood of having more adults later on down the line. It takes about 2 decades or more just for a generation to become sexually mature. So whatever happens now, we might not see the results from what's laid now for a very, very long time.
And so in the stretch of beach that we're in, you could actually be standing on top of a nest and not even know it. We have such a high density of nests. Within a half a kilometer stretch, you could have anywhere from upwards to 50 nests within an area. So it's a very dense nesting beach.
This is one of the most important loggerhead nesting areas left in the United States. In other places, they've been destroyed by beachfront development and construction.
And we want to repat this down to make it nice and firm, just like the mom does whenever she's covering her nest. She pats the sand down, puts her own body weight onto these in order to compact the sand to make it a perfect little microclimate and microhabitat area.
So a loggerhead lays about an average of 110 eggs, and she'll do this about 5 to 7 times a season, and she'll come back and lay her nest like every other year. Many people want to know, well, how in the world do they know how to get back to the beach that they were born at 20 some odd years down the road?
Just like migrating birds, sea turtles can orient themselves to the Earth's magnetic poles. That incredible ability allows them to return to the same place for life, which places tremendous importance on beaches like Sebastian. If the turtles that were born here can't return to lay their eggs here, they won't lay them anywhere.
Sea turtles need a sustainable, healthy beach to have nesting habitat, reproductive success for these endangered species.
It's not enough to just lay down sand. You need to keep enough sand to make a wide enough beach that the turtles can lay their eggs well above the high tide mark. That's where man-made solutions like planting sea oats can help, without building artificial barriers like in Miami Beach.
Having a healthy beach means having a large enough area to have variability in where their nests can be laid. You don't want all their nests to be laid right near the tide line, because with changing tides, you can wash over nests, and when nests get washed over, then they don't become successful in the end. And you don't want all of your nests stuck up in a vegetated dune either, because there's a higher proportion of predators up in the dune. And you also don't want your beach covered in seawalls or hard structures, because those areas are more likely to erode at a quicker rate. And when you have high erosion rates, then you're gonna have more sand being taken away from the nest, or even have nests exposed.
Turtles evolved over millions of years, long before humans walked the planet. To preserve this ancient lineage, it's critical to turn back time and make this living beach as natural as possible. And that means restricting some modern amenities, like electric lights.
Artificial lighting these days on the back of hotels, condos, houses has been found to be extremely detrimental. And this is because our hatchlings have this natural ability to follow the moonlight. And so when you have a full moon over the ocean, you have this lit up water area which attracts these turtles to the water. But when you have this artificial light component over on the other side of the beach, it's a little bit brighter, and those turtles are going to be naturally attracted to that brighter light, which is going to cause them to go the wrong direction. It could put them in the way of a predator. And you can even start putting them in developed areas on the back porch of someone's condo, or swimming in someone's pool, or even get run over by people's cars in the middle of the street.
Even with all that effort, nature stacks the odds against these turtle eggs ever hatching. Birds, domestic dogs, snakes, and raccoons all prey on eggs and hatchlings. Predators raid up to half the loggerhead nests on some U.S. beaches. So protecting every little bit of beach nesting habitat is crucial. Straddling the line between natural and man-made, Sebastian Island's beach is a model of management. The needs of people, fish, birds, and turtles, all carefully considered and controlled, with a steady hand and a light touch. Three beaches. 3 ways to deal with the natural forces of the wind and waves. From a man-made strip of sand built to protect hotels in Miami Beach from the worst the ocean can offer, to Sebastian, a beach managed for tourists and turtles alike. To Sanibel Island, a natural beauty where nature is protected and allowed to flourish unencumbered by human development. Finding the sweet spot between the Sunshine State's ecological and economic interests is a fine art. On the living beach.